philosophy, of Greek philosophy, is that play a role in some of the false teachings of the Trinity, such as Arianism and other things. Maybe we need to explain even what Arianism is for those who are not familiar with the term.
Yeah. So there's a lot there in that question, and this is also addressed in the books. But I'll try to give a short answer here. So there's a philosophical understanding that comes from classical Greek philosophy that claims that the supreme being is absolutely simple, timeless, strictly immutable, and strictly impassible. Now, let me unpack what those things mean and then why it caused so much trouble.
Some raised the question about the simplicity of God. That was one of the questions we received.
It is a bit of a misnomer because it's not a simple concept. But so the name is misleading a bit. So basically, before I define those, let me just say many of the controversies among early Christians throughout the ages, about which they had council after council after council, many of the controversies were rooted in this understanding, and in some ways caused by this understanding. That's where we'll come back to this with Arianism. But divine simplicity is the view that is rooted in Greek philosophy, that God is absolutely simple, which means God can have no complexity in his being whatsoever. And if you understand that, you can see already that's going to be a big problem for the Trinity, because it's about absolute oneness of a kind that excludes any actual complexity or differentiation in the Trinity. So that created all kinds of conundrums. Now, today, some people use that term to just mean God is one. They use it in a very generic sense. But in the classical sense, in the strict sense, God can have no complexity at all. The second one is the view that God is timeless. When they say God is timeless, the simplest way to understand this is they mean that God is incompatible with time, where time is a succession of moments.
Now, can I just interrupt for a second here?
Yes.
You know, if the normal person, I would say, in the pew, is often talks about God's timelessness, and meaning that he's just eternal.
Yes.
Is that the same that you're talking about here when we casually speak about?
It's not the same. So we all affirm that God is eternal, meaning he's everlasting, because the Bible teaches that. But when they say God is timeless, they don't just mean he has no beginning and no end. They mean that he has no before and after in his life. That means God can have no succession in his life, which entails that God cannot do one thing and then do another. God cannot look forward to the future, like it says he does in Zephaniah 3:17, when he looks forward to his bride and delighting over his bride. And it has all kinds of implications. It means, or at least it seems to mean by many critics of this understanding, that God cannot enter into time and space and interact with creatures, which creates big problems for the incarnation, God becoming human in Jesus. How can Jesus be God if he walks around in space and time?
And even for revelation and inspiration, it will be
it creates problems for almost every doctrine, but especially in the doctrine of God, and especially the doctrine of Trinity. And the last two of those is that God is strictly immutable, meaning he cannot change at all, including relational changes, right? Which means he could not become human, right? At least if you understand that as an actual change that affects God. And they say he is impassible, meaning he cannot be affected by anything. Now, why did this cause so much trouble? Well, there's a number of ways that this set the foundation of the doctrine of God, added all kinds of philosophical trappings that then were folded in to biblical concepts in a way that many criticize as unbiblical. But one thing I'll mention here is it was one of the driving forces behind Arianism. Arianism was the teaching in the 4th century of an individual by the name of Arius, who claimed that there was a time when the Son was not. He's not eternal, and he's not divine with the full divinity of the Father. And one of the main arguments that Arius made is he believed God is timeless, in the way I just defined, that God is strictly immutable, cannot change, and he is strictly impassible. And then he said Jesus of Nazareth was obviously none of those things. Right? He suffered on the cross. You can't do that if you're impassible. He walked and he talked and he underwent many kinds of changes. And so he said, Jesus must be some kind of a lesser being than the Father, because he thought the Father was timeless, immutable, and impassible. Now, if you don't affirm those beliefs about God, which I do not, because I do not believe the Bible teaches them. In fact, I believe the Bible teaches many things that directly contradict that classical understanding. If you don't start with that understanding that God is timeless and immutable and impassible, you don't have many of these problems that were big problems in Trinitarian understandings in the early ages of Christianity, the post-apostolic age we're talking about, the 3rd and 4th century and beyond primarily, and many Christological controversies. They had council after council after council trying to understand how this timeless, immutable, impassible deity could yet become incarnate, right? If you have a different understanding, this doesn't raise the same kind of problems. Of course, there's much more to say about the philosophical background. That just scratches the surface. But that understanding actually was the underpinning of the way that the Council of Nicaea extrapolated on the doctrine of the Trinity. Now, the main view that Christians are trying to affirm at Nicaea, that there is one God, and God is 3 persons, the Father, Son, and the Spirit, that is true. But in trying to explain it and also trying to combat Arius and others who followed him, they added explanations that were based on a particular philosophical understanding of God that many of us believe just do not have biblical warrant, and even at times contradict Scripture.
Well, just listening to you, John, tells me that you are a very knowledgeable person on this particular question, and I'm so glad you are, because this is what is needed. Otherwise, you hear certain phrases, you hear certain terminology, and you think just because they sound familiar to you, they mean the same. And we need to understand the deeper theological, philosophical issues that are involved in that. And as I was looking through these volumes, I have both volumes here with me, it is interesting. If you want to learn more about what we just touched at the surface, really, just briefly, please go to those 2 volumes. I've written it down. In Volume 1, there are several chapters in Volume 1 alone exploring this specific question more fully. Or there's Chapter 4, the Trinity in Theology. There's Chapter 5, the God of the philosophers and the God of the Bible. It's exactly what we are talking about. There's Chapter 6, the Trinity in Roman Catholicism and in Adventism. What are the similarities? What are the differences between the two? And then we have Volume 2, continuing the same thing, enlarging that even further. There are several chapters more exploring this subject. Chapter 37, how do the forms of the Nicene creeds differ from the biblical view of the Trinity? Just what you just touched briefly.